What is going on? I want to welcome you from Half Court for today. I am Sean Murphy, joined by a special guest today, the beat writer for the Detroit Free Press for the Detroit Pistons, also the co-host of the Pistons Pulse podcast with our guy Bryce Simon, Motor City Hoops, the legend, Omari Sankofa the second. Omari, it's great to see you again, man. Welcome back to the podcast. How's it going, man?
Man, I'm good. Great to see you too. Obviously, a busy time of the year and a lot to talk about before we're back at the PPC for training camp. So excited, man.
Yeah, man. It feels like it's going to be a blink of an eye, and we're already going to be back there for media day, talking to everyone about their summers. It's crazy how quickly this summer's already flown by, and a lot has happened in a short period of time. It feels like you blink, and the landscape of the league changed like twice over again.
Yeah, that's how it goes this time of year. Things are a bit unpredictable, including for the Pistons.
Yep.
Thankfully, nothing super crazy, but when free agency starts, you never like quite know how things are going to go down, and
Yeah.
and there's been some moves around the league that have been a little surprising as well. So
Yeah. Before we talk Pistons, what's kind of been your favorite move or most curious move from like the entire league? Like, what was the one that kind of the Shams notification that hit your phone that kind of made your eyebrow raise a little bit?
I think the one I like the most, honestly, is Kevin Durant to Houston
Yeah.
because like there were two teams that to me were just like the obvious Kevin Durant like landing spots. And Houston probably topped that list, and Orlando was my second one, just because those are like two elite defensive teams that just could
Yep.
not generate a bucket. And when you watched Orlando, well, I mean, when you watch both teams in the playoffs, it was just like these teams just do not have enough to like generate a bucket when you need one. And all
Right.
of Orlando's dudes are like 6'10", so I get why they weren't in the mix. And I actually love the Desmond Bain trade too. I think he's perfect for him.
Yeah.
But KD to Houston, and they didn't even give up a lot. I think that's just perfect. I think he checks every single box that they needed, and that's going to be a good team next year. So we'll see.
Yeah, most definitely. The fact that they were able to bring in Kevin Durant and then also Dorian Finney Smith, and really all they had to give up was Jalen Green, Dylan Brooks, and a number 10 pick in this year's draft. They still have a lot of Phoenix's assets. And in the crazy scenario that Giannis somehow becomes available someday, they might still have put themselves in pole position to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean they're in pretty good shape. Part of the nice thing about when you build a young team and you don't have any super heavy salaries is that it kind of gives you that malleability to kind of make those types of moves if it gets to that point. But I mean, they were an elite team last year. I just think that they were due for that type of swing, and even then, you still didn't have to give up a whole lot. I mean, they've got
Yeah.
so many young players that I mean, they're just giving them away at this point just to get them opportunities. So,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, a good move by them for sure.
Yeah, no question. And then Orlando, it's literally been almost 15 years since they've had an offense above the top 20. So to go get a guy like Desmond Bain to help them is definitely going to make them a lot more competitive. So it's going to be a fun season next year. And one thing that you said that actually kind of set up where I wanted to go perfectly was, how Houston being a young team with malleability, it looks like Trajan is kind of going for that, as far as how he's approaching this rebuild or this organization in Detroit specifically. He went and signed Karis LeVert and Duncan Robinson this offseason. If you look at a lot of the contracts he's signed, really the only player he's signed for long-term money is Cade Cunningham. Everyone else has been on 2 or 3 year deals with non-guarantees or partial guarantees, and very tradable. And then even the players that he's gotten themselves, are players that have versatility or you can slot into different positions. So, kind of from your perspective, like what was kind of, Detroit's goal going into the offseason? And despite some of the turbulence, how would you assess like how closely they stuck to that goal?
Yeah, I mean the primary goal going in was always just to continue to build around the young guys. They weren't really in the mix for like a Kevin Durant or Desmond Bain type move. I think timeline wise, they see themselves as maybe a year or two behind those teams where they're still figuring out which of their core guys they could fully commit to, and which guys are going to be the ones who can lead this thing alongside Cade. So it was always going to be more marginal moves that more so reflect that you're a team that's building. Um, Nothing too crazy, but a lot of that. I mean, they wanted to bring back Malik Beasley, obviously, and that didn't work out. And then
Right.
once you decide to not bring back Beasley, that kind of sets up a chain reaction where, obviously they went and got Karis LeVert with the MLD, and you have LeVert with the boss. And I was like, well, maybe we don't go get Schroeder, so you go get Duncan Robinson with the sign and trade, and then they re-signed Paul Reed, and uh, I don't know if a day before free agency, they imagined that that's how things were going to go before the Beasley news broke out. But at the end of it, they still check a lot of the same boxes. You have secondary ball handling. You've got, an elite shooter. And the core of that's still like, at the end of the day, Kate and the other guys are going to be the ones that turn this around. So
Yep.
it didn't play out how they expected necessarily, but at the end of the day, I still think they stuck to what their core goal was, which was to still highlight the young guys.
Yeah. And Trajan talked, before in the offseason about how, with free agency, it takes two to tango, kind of hinting that, it might not be possible to bring everyone back. I don't think he necessarily foresaw the circumstances as to why some guys wouldn't be back, but it definitely seems like, they had a backup plan, but I don't know if they expected to get there in that way. And even Trajan said like he doesn't know for sure if the team will be better next season. And I don't even know if I would say if this roster is definitively better or worse. I would say it's different for sure. Like I don't think Karis LeVert is a 1-for-1 replacement of a Malik Beasley or a Dennis Schroeder, but he's going to be playing, like as Trajan said yesterday, he's going to be kind of helping fill in a little bit of those like backup point guard responsibilities of handling the basketball. And he's going to be definitely someone that the Pistons rely on as a scorer, and I'd imagine someone off their second unit, to really help and bring production on that side of the ball. It's not going to be 1-for-1 for either, but he does bring other skill sets and things to the team that those guys didn't necessarily bring.
Yeah, different players for sure. I think with Duncan, you do get a lot of what you get with Beasley, just
Yep.
being an elite shooter. He's knocking down 273s, he's knocking down 250, like, career 40% shooter. So you know exactly what you're getting with him, and
Yep.
he's not the exact same type of player as Beasley, but the main takeaway is obviously just that he checks the same box, and you need
Yep.
like at least one elite shooter to have a functional offense in today's league. Obviously, and then with that, Karis, who's I think he's a different archetype of player than they had at all last season among the vets.
Yep.
Where he can kind of go get his own bucket, like he can knock down threes, but he could also get to the rim and knock down shots from mid range as well. But I think he has a reputation as a guy who gets his own, but he's always been a good passer too. I mean, he's got a career, ratio of 4 assists to like 1.8 turnovers or something like that. Like he reads the floor. Trajan said yesterday that like he's going to be handling secondary playmaking responsibilities. So is he a point guard? Point guard like Dennis Schroeder? No, but I think the expectation, or at least the hope, is that on a team with Cade and Jaden Ivey, you can get away with maybe having that more traditional point guard, and you just add players who can take some of the ball handling responsibilities away. So again, a lot of the same thinking lines. It just
Yep.
manifested a little bit differently in the actual players on the floor.
Yeah, most definitely. And to your point with Duncan Robinson, I think the big thing that you get there is it like you said, is just the consistency, both as just like like the person both on and off the court, with the way that he plays and the way he goes about his business. Listening a little bit to his podcast, like he's a really smart guy who knows a lot about basketball. And I remember last year at Motor City Cruise Media Day, Cole Swider at the time, who was on on the Motor City Cruise, he talked about his time with the Heat organization, and just how much of a help Duncan Robinson was to him, and how much he gave him advice and tips on ways to approach the game. And being an undrafted free agent who turned into a guy who's played multiple finals games, an all-time leading three-point shooter for the Heat organization. Like that's a pretty quality veteran to bring in. And again, like the contract, if you look at it, after it's really only 1 year truly guaranteed. And from there, it's very team friendly on the back end.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I reported that 3 year deal for 48 million, but the second year is partially guaranteed, and the third year is non-guaranteed. So, really, you could view it as a 1 or 2 year commitment. You part ways next off season. He still gets a chunk of that 16 million owed, but it's just dead money for that year, and then like you're off the obligation. If you're the Pistons, you probably don't sign them with the expectation that you're going to add dead money, but it's kind of like an NFL deal. It's not really a $48 million contract. It's more like
Right.
32. And if for whatever reason you want to go into that third year, you can do that. But yeah, flexibility. Obviously that was sort of a late pivot from Bees, but you replace a lot of the same things without overcommitting beyond that second year. So a lot of flexibility in that deal. And then obviously Karras being the MLE. There's a lot of guys who are in that range, 14 billion around the league, and that should be a pretty flexible contract too. So neither of those guys are guys that add significant amounts to the books or anything like that.
Yeah, for sure. I know another guy that, Detroit was pretty heavily kind of highlighted in the 11th hour was Nikhil Alexander Walker. Do you think that was just too late in the process? It sounds like Atlanta, at least like Trey Young was recruiting him pretty heavily. I know technically the window starts on that Monday, at 6 when free agency opens, but there's always some conversations that happen behind back doors before that time. Do you think it was just too late in the process for Detroit to be in on Nikhil Alexander Walker?
Yeah, I don't know if it was too late in the process. I think Atlanta has some mechanisms that made it a bit easier for them to, go and like get them because like they had a trade exception for one,
Yeah.
which they were able to use to pay him his salary. So there's always a lot of moving parts in these deals, and I don't know if Atlanta was viewed as like the top contender like a week before the process opened, but it just
Right.
shows how quickly things can move. And I think they had a really good offseason. They were really aggressive. Nikhil Alexander Walker would have fit really well in Detroit, but that's just not how things shook out for him.
Yeah, for sure. And also like when you look at the contract as well, like I believe he got a 4-year deal. I'm not sure if that was fully guaranteed or if there are options or things on the back end or not, but a little bit more of a long-term commitment, whereas Detroit still kind of has themselves set up in the future for, for some flexibility. And, I know that fans, like you brought up earlier, how Detroit wasn't it, like, it wasn't in the Kevin Durant trade or, any of those things. I know fans, in the NBA, the culture around the league is, just all the big movement and the massive transactions that happen. And I think for a fan base like Detroit, where you don't see those transactions very often, I think there's almost like just a hunger for change for the sake of change sometimes from fans. And also I think that's just expedited by all these injuries and how wide open, it optically the Eastern Conference looks, just because of all of the change and things that we've seen. Do you think that, because again, like Trajan, he very much stuck to his guns and seemed like, that was something that, it was like, we're just going to stick to the course. Do you think that was like a difficult decision, or do you think there were conversations being had about like, what does it look like to go and make a move?
Yeah, I think they vet everything out, and if you have a chance to go get a guy and like it's like completely within your range to be able to do that. Obviously they have their draft picks and everything back now. You go and do that. I still think the core issue is just that outside of Cade, you're gonna have to pay at least one of these other guys, maybe two of them,
Yep.
and I think it's just difficult from a front office standpoint to commit big money to a player and then have that obligation when you now have to in the future find ways to pay your other young guys. So,
Yep.
I think they vet and plan for everything. But at the end of the day, especially when you look at the price it took to go get some of those guys, it just wasn't practical really
Yeah.
for him to go and do that at this point. And, I bring this up over at the Pistons Post, but you look at what Indiana did with Pascal Siakam. That was a trade deadline move. And, Derek White for Boston was a trade deadline move.
Yep.
Aaron Gordon for Denver was a trade deadline move. I think people kind of fall into the trap of we don't do it now. Like the opportunity is not going to come back around. And for basketball, like that's just not true. Like your window
Yeah.
is open. Like as long as you've got star talent, and teams find ways to rebuild on the fly quickly when they already have a star in place. And there's just a lot more malleability and maneuverability than I think folks see, which is fine. Like the longer I do this, the more I realize that there's just an appeal to a transaction that is always going to have a strong hold over
Yep.
fans. And I mean, I'm a sports fan too. Like I certainly get that. But for the Pistons, it's just not practical at this point. At the very least, you have to figure out, okay, like, are we paying Jalen Duren and Jaden Ivey and how much? And then
Yep.
you have a SAR, and it's always going to be somebody. So you just can't commit big salary knowing that you have other big commitments coming up. I think that overcomplicates things more than you probably need
Yeah.
them to be.
Yeah. And especially when you talk about those extensions and the money that you have to pay players down the road, one really interesting element of that is, traditionally we see the salary cap go up by like 10% every single year. But I believe this upcoming year, I think they're projecting for the salary cap to only go up by 7, which I know that a lot of teams make moves kind of under, that assumption or under the operation of that salary cap going up by 10%. And, with between, regional sports networks and just kind of with like the redistribution of how revenue share is going to work kind of in sports, in the future, like I do think those are things that you kind of have to, factor in of like how much more important it is, especially in this league where we see these first and second aprons and the essentially a hard salary cap like we've never seen before in the NBA. Like if you want to talk about ways that you can completely limit your window and your future right away, it's by making bad salary decisions.
Yeah, and once you have and a bad salary, because the decision may not even start off as bad, but again, when you go trade for a good vet and the salary that comes with that, like you're on the hook. If there's any injuries or anything else, you traded for a guy that didn't make you a championship team. Now it's just a problem that has to be solved,
Yeah.
essentially, right? And especially that, like as you mentioned, with the new salary cap moves, like teams are prioritizing flexibility more and more because at the end of the day, you really can't have more than 2 max contracts and remain competitive. I mean, that's why Boston just like they're trading all their good role players and vets now because they just can't afford to pay them.
Yeah.
You have a team that just won a championship 2 years ago, and Tatum's injury factors into that too. But even if Tatum were healthy, they still would have had to have done that
Yeah.
just because of how punitive the taxes are. And this is the Boston Celtics, so uh, yeah, like the behind the scenes cap stuff can be boring, but it's very much like all that stuff, dictates how teams build and their timelines and why they decide to, punt like the Pistons have obviously at this time.
Yeah, for sure. And especially for a team like Boston, I think their payroll with if they were to be in the tax and in the second apron was going to exceed like $500 million because they were a repeater team too. So, and Brad Stevens literally said as much of we made those moves because of the second apron. So teams are being very conscientious of that. Do you and it feels like, just from watching Trajan operate, bringing in Michael Blackstone and, seeing how meticulous they are with the salary cap and with those things, it seems like this is as conscientious of a front office as we've had when it comes to salary cap decisions. Perhaps that still remain to be seen because, who knows what moves they make in the future. They could always, get more aggressive down the road. But as of right now, this seems like a front office that's very, salary cap conscientious.
Yeah, they are. They're salary cap and asset conscientious. I mean, you could even see that like with the Dennis Schroeder signing trade. Like they
Yep.
just like they really wanted that TPE, for 14.3 billion, which is just another tool that they could use. And yeah, I mean that's been their mo. Asset focused, maintaining that flexibility, and finding ways to kind of add to your asset chest. Like with Dennis Schroeder, like losing him in free agency, you still find a way to turn that into something that can help you out within the next year. So, like, I think
Yep.
that's been fair to say for sure. They've been very asset focused and try to increase all the tools they have available to help move the needle for this team going forward.
Yeah, no question. And I'm glad you brought that up. It was crazy to see all the unrest and energy about this whole sign and trade saga with the Sacramento Kings and the Detroit Pistons. Like there was almost no question once once it came out what the Kings were going to pay Dennis that he was not going to return to Detroit, but it was really a matter of what that was going to look like. I know Malik Monk was a really popular name and someone that a lot of people wanted to see in a Pistons uniform. It was someone that the Kings are seemingly wanting to offload that salary and even showing how they can't do that for a player who's pretty quality at not a terribly big salary. Speaks a lot to where the salary cap is. And like you said, they get that 14.5 million trade exception. I know Trajan said he doesn't seem to be in a rush to use that. Do you think there's a benefit to them waiting until the deadline to utilize that exception and to see where this roster is? Or do you think there's a glaring enough hole to where it might behoove them to explore using that option before training camp?
No, I mean I think they could bring it into the season. If there's one roster hole at this point, like it's probably just some sort of backup four, unless you
Yep.
feel pretty confident about Ron Holland and Asar being your fours. But you trade Simone Fontecchio for Duncan Robinson, and so Duncan's a lot bigger than Beasley and Schroeder, but he's still smaller than Tech and probably not quite a guy who's going to fill in behind Tobias Harris. So they also still have the 5.1 million biannual exception, and they could go, just get like an inexpensive backup for,
Hmm.
somewhere. So like that's one option that they have, but I think that there's merit to just bring in the TPE into the season because like I guess at this point you got to look at just the roster friction that a lot of teams have already kind of figured out to some extent at this point, and you'll still probably have some deals that shake loose like late August, early September, like they always do. But you're probably going to see a lot more movement going up into the trade deadline as
Yep.
teams get a better idea of how competitive they are or aren't. And some of the teams that aren't are probably going to want to shed salary if they don't, feel good about their prospects. And then that's where it's good to kind of have this voucher for 14.3 billion that you can just use to absorb, a salary of any player within that range. Like that's MLE range. So there's a lot of solid role players around the league that you potentially could acquire with that. So
Yeah.
they don't. Yeah, I mean, I don't think they need to use it now. It lasts a year. Like they have a year to use the TPE, and like I said earlier, I think it's perfectly valid to see where you are at the trade deadline and then strike from there.
Yeah, most definitely. And I like what you said earlier too, just about how like there's almost like an urgency or people feel like, the opportunity is now to go make a move that opportunity won't come again. But, like you said, teams, every team is going to feel some form of excitement or enthusiasm about the roster they have and some hope for the future. But once reality of the 82 game season sets in, once you're like a month or two into the season, we've seen how quickly teams' attitudes about their rosters or the players on them, can change. And, I think there's merit to waiting until the deadline and seeing how situations develop because you can never know, what players become available. I know someone that, it's like, someone who's kind of been like coveted on Pistons Twitter as like a potential player they could go after at some point. It's like a PJ Washington. And I know that's someone that they really like the idea of playing alongside Cooper Flag right now, but what's that fit look like 3 or 4 months down the road? Like you never know what players could become available because of those situations.
Yeah, exactly. I look at Pascal Siakam, and you look at what
Yep.
Indiana was able to get him for, and you figure that price probably would have been bigger like that previous summer. Had they made that move then, in the middle of like a more robust market. I think the trade deadline chaos can help teams, that have that flexibility. I mean, the Pistons could just sit back and say, "Hey, you want to send this PJ Washington? Yeah, like we'll take
Yeah.
them, and you don't got to give up anything else." And it could really solve a problem for certain teams. So yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens with it, obviously, but That also kind of goes into the thinking where people will say, well, the league's going to be wide open next season. Uh, like you actually don't know that because for
Right.
one, like Oklahoma's still going to be around, and like again, like I think there's assumptions you make at the time, and you really don't know where anything's going to be 6 7 months
Right.
in the future. So if there's one thing you don't want to do, you don't want to make a move out of fear because it's like, well, I don't know if this is going to be here in the future. It's either a good deal that makes sense or it's not. Like you can't have like a fear based mindset when you're making those types of moves.
Right. And I know we've seen young teams defy what's possible or what's realistic, in terms of the optics of the league. But even if Detroit were to go make, like a competitive move, I still think when you look at the history of the league, it would be a lot to ask for a team who, just 2 years ago now won 14 games. This last year, pushed the Knicks to, almost 7 to then make it to the finals. Like you don't see that type of rise at that rate. It generally takes a gradual approach of getting deeper and deeper into the playoffs. So like to me, that's why I feel like the goal of advancing in the playoffs is a good realistic goal for the Pistons to have when it comes to this season.
Yeah, they exceeded expectations last season. Obviously, we don't have to relitigate all of that, but that's part of it too. Is that you have to give it a chance to see if it could actually be sustained on its own merits. If you're at the trade deadline and you're 6 7 games over 500, then it's like, all right, like it's go time, right?
Yep.
And it gives you a window to see how much of last season was real, before you go and make any other big commitments. I look at the Sacramento Kings where they went and added expensive vets to a team that wasn't going to compete anyway, right? They're just trying to
Yep.
keep that window open, and now you're kind of just stuck in the middle. That's where the Pistons are trying to avoid being. They want to make sure that what they have is valid, essentially, before they start paying guys and before they start making those bigger moves.
Yeah, and I keep reference. I know it, to the people listening to this podcast, I might be beating a dead horse. I really don't care. Sam Presti, there was that quote after they won the championship that was going around about how shortcuts cut long runs short. And I think for a franchise that just got their first playoff win in 17 years, that historically is a proud franchise with a lot of history and, is one of the more storied franchises in the NBA when it comes to that legacy. I think there's something to be said about like, yes, you want to be able to contend, but you also want to build something that has legs to it, that going forward, even if you do have to retool, that you don't have to dip to the bottom depths of the league and that you have something that, even if you do have to retool, it doesn't take nearly as long.
Yeah. The other thing to keep in mind in all this is that, Cade is like what, 23 years old. He's
Yeah.
still very much at the beginning of this process for him. And obviously next year is like year one of his 5 year max extension deal. So, you've got some time, but I think along with that, you don't want to you don't want it to get too late in
Yeah.
the process. I look at OKC, like Shea is what, like 26,
Yep.
and they were terrible a couple years ago. So again, like I think you look at other teams and how they've done it, and like that's what the Pistons are trying to model. And the most successful teams typically have kind of slow played things enough to where you find that balance of, okay, we can pay our own guys, but now we could also go and get a Isaiah Hartenstein or a Caruso or
Mhm.
whoever else you need to help boost your odds going forward.
Yeah, and even with these young teams like OKC, 5 of their 12 rotation players in the playoffs were either undrafted or second round picks. Like all the talk about their top picks and a lot of those like heavy like, MVP or all-star caliber assets, but a lot of those guys were deep draft or or like undrafted free agency finds. And so, when you look at guys like Chaz Lanier or when you look at, like the Pistons G League roster, like I know people might be quick to overlook those things, but in this hard cap league, hitting in those rounds has become more important than ever, especially if you want to keep a team competitive for a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, you look at a guy like Jalen Williams, not the All Star Jalen Williams, but the big man, Jalen
Yeah.
Williams. You know, he was a later pick, but he's been an excellent glue guy for him. I think he's had like triple doubles in like his last three starts or something crazy, which is
Yep.
insane. But he gave them good depth during the playoffs too. I don't think we saw him in the finals as much, but he certainly appeared in other series, and those things help out. Like certainly when you have young guys on those cheap deals that you're able to develop and get something out of. Like I'm curious about Bobby Clintman for the Pistons. Like just going back to that conversation about
Yep.
like backup four. Like if there's anybody on the roster who has sort of the size and skill set to kind of replace what Fontaine Hill gave you, it's Bobby Clintman. So I'm curious to see if he could kind of become one of those guys for the Pistons going forward.
Yeah. And as much buzz as there was about Ron Holland this last season, the guy that everyone was talking about last summer league was Bobby Clintman. I know it's summer league, so to me, I didn't really read as much into that stuff, but I remember being really curious to see what he can do. But then I remember right before the Pistons open practice started, they came up and told us that Clintman was dealing with a calf issue. And then from there, we just never really got to see him very much that season. But, I do think that if Detroit is going to be successful, they will need guys like that at some point to hit and to be able to lean on at those lower salary points.
Yeah, and this is a franchise that's hit on second round picks in the past. And if anything, they haven't valued their second round picks enough, right? We look at
Yeah.
some of the guys that they've drafted and let go. So we'll see. Like you never want to put too much pressure on the second round pick, but guys like Bobby Clintman, guys like Chaz Nadir, those are the guys who could come in and like you see obvious NBA skill. So it's just can we kind of channel that? Yeah, I mean Bobby's what like 6'9", 6'10", like he's giving you some legit size right there. So we'll see. We'll see. They have if it's one thing that they also haven't had in the last few years, it's just those second round picks that have hit and like really kind of prop things up as well and become core guys.
Yeah. They like for all the first round busts they had over the years, they had a lot of second round pick guys that hit. If you go back and look at it, it's kind of crazy.
No, I mean they really have. Like the Pistons, like over the last, you could probably go back 15, 16 years and see numerous guys drafted in from the late first round through like the mid second who have had and are still having good NBA careers. So I know that's
Yeah.
different front offices, but this team has never historically that hasn't been an issue. It's just properly valuing those guys, and it just goes into the conversation, right? You end up getting guys who initially at least are are on pretty inexpensive deals and you need that. You need young guys who are on inexpensive deals if you want to build a deep roster. Like it's just no way around that.
Yeah. Without question. The as far as the extension conversations with Dern and Ivy, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the sense of we saw this season with the free agency class just how tricky things got with like with restricted free agency, guys like Jonathan Kaminga, Cam Thomas, having a hard time finding deals. Even some guys who hit that point, the teams generally actually had like more leverage. Normally you're worried about guys getting like a big offer sheet. That wasn't really a thing that happened this offseason and with this salary cap situation. So do you think that's something that Detroit looks at? And do you think there's almost a little more comfort with those guys hitting restricted free agency if they don't necessarily agree on an extension this summer?
I think, yeah. I mean, you hit on it, but like Quentin Grimes, Kaminga, Cam Thomas, and Josh Giddey, I think are the four guys who are just stuck in kind of restricted free agency limbo right now. And what's happened, over the course of the years with the CBA changes and everything, is that teams don't go into the offseason with a lot of cap space anymore.
Yep.
The goal of the CBA changes were to encourage teams to re-sign their own guys. And for the most part, we just see it's a different market now where players tend to sign extensions and then they just get traded. So there's a much stronger trade economy and not as strong of a free agency economy compared to past years. And coming into this offseason, like Brooklyn was the only team that had like real cap space. So the other teams can only offer like mid level or like this and that because they're just limited in being able to make a competitive offer sheet. And I think the other thing with that too is that when you like just the entire offer sheet system, uh, like I just think the pace of it is a little bit too slow for modern free agency now as well because now the money's tied up to the offer and the team has to decide to match
Yep.
or this or that. Um, I think it's just the concept of restricted free agency is just becoming a little bit more antiquated almost. Like I just think it's an awkward fit in a modern CBA, and it's a bad spot for players to be in, to just kind of be stuck in limbo. The team that they play for give them an offer that they feel is too low, but where's that other money going to come from? So
Right.
now it's like, but do you just lock in the long term money, or do you pick up the qualifying offer and now you're an unrestricted free agent next year, and maybe you could get that money now. Long story short, I just think there's a lot of uncertainty with that process that I think teams and players would prefer to avoid. And I look at Houston and like how they signed Shingun and Green, and now they just signed Jabari Smith Jr. To good deals, but none of those contracts are like max contracts, right?
Right.
And obviously none of those guys have played like max guys before they extended, which is why they were able to sign for less. But what you see is that, you know, like with Jalen Green, for example, he signed a 3-year deal that was over 100 million. He's not a 30 plus a million a year player at this point right now, right? But
Yeah.
you pay him that based on his potential. But even if he hasn't delivered on that potential, you can still trade that in a separate deal. Like if it comes down to it, if you decide, okay, like we're not bidding around Jalen Green, now he's on the salary, and like that salary is tradable. So from a team standpoint, it's just good to have those players signed if you could get them on a pretty reasonable deal, or like not overpay too much.
Yep.
And bringing it back to Ivy and Duran, I think it's just like what's a fair rate, for guys that have shown a lot, but obviously still have a lot of development ahead of them. And I think the Houston model is probably the best mix of like, we could take care of the player, but also make sure we're not over leveraging or over committing ourselves.
For sure.
And we'll see if the Pistons have that type of pathway. But like again, I just think restricted free agency could be a really kind of awkward spot to be in. And if you're the Pistons, it's like, do you want to figure out Ivy, Duran, and Asar in the same offseason? Because
Yeah.
that's what you would be facing. So we'll see. But I do think the way that Houston is going about things probably threads the needle the best between flexibility, but also making sure that your player or players are taken care of.
Yeah. No question. And of those three players, I would probably say that I would probably feel the most comfortable about Asar being the one that's most likely to get extended on a big deal. As far as, with Duran and Ivy, to me, that's just, it's, it was already a difficult read before the Jaden Ivy injury. And then that just adds a whole other element. I know he's going to be able to come back and should be 100% based on the type of injury that he had, but setbacks are setbacks, right? So I am curious to see, of those two players, like which one is more likely to get extended, and is there almost like a, does it make sense for Detroit to, allow a guy like Jalen Duran to have restricted free agency looming and see what, types of heights he can reach this season based on like high and low play over the last couple of years. It's really it's a difficult position to be in if you're a front office for sure.
It is. I think with Ivy, what complicates it a bit is just the fact that he got injured. So, the bulk of his work had happened under a previous front office. And now you have a new team, man, that's on for 30 games. And in the 30 games he played was probably the best 30 game stretch of his career, but
Yeah.
it's still only 30 games. I think at least with Duran, the front office has acknowledged this, like he's acknowledged it, and we all saw it. Like he got better as the year went on, and he
Yeah.
didn't start off that well. But by the time you got to the playoffs, like he was a guy that was like solving key issues on the floor. Like his passing allowed Asar Thompson to be on the floor, and like with Isaiah Stewart hurt, he was the only guy with the size and strength to be able to rebound and kind of bang down low with Mitchell Robinson and to a lesser extent Carl Anthony Towns. But the rebounding obviously, like he's a guy that solves real problems for you, and I think that combined with his youth at least helps some to an extent. Where it's like we saw him get better as the year went on. He played his best basketball in the playoffs. So
Yep.
at the very least, that he's a guy that can rise to the moment. And, if anything, that probably gives you a bit more security of like he's a young guy, but we saw him grow up. And like that's all you can really ask for, a guy that's as young as Duran is, just to show up when the moments matter, which he did.
Yeah, when he realized like what he could do with his athletic abilities, when he forced the issue and when he like, inserted himself into the game instead of waiting for the game to come to him, it felt like things really started to, to really change. And like you said, he admitted it. He said he came out soft that first
Yeah.
couple months of the year, and those are his words, not mine. So, the fact that he recognized it and really showed that growth is definitely something you're excited about. Um, we only have a couple minutes, so before we let you go, I am curious, like from your perspective, like you brought up like Bobby Clipman as a player that you're interested to see. Like, who's an X factor on this team that you're personally interested to see where they go next season, and like who's a player that you think potentially can decide whether or not Detroit does take that leap and improve next year?
I'm gonna say Ron Holland. Um, I think he's still kind of the X factor in that he's like the newest addition, like to this core that had kind of been underway for a few years. He's the only lottery pick of this new front office. It might be the only lottery pick for this new front office for a bit. But just the way he plays, like just how relentless he is, the energy, and just his knack for making good plays. You combine that with some of the finishing we saw. Like there's a lot there that could really turn him, I think, into a unique or special player down the road. And at this point, it's like, okay, Cade is all NBA. You feel pretty good about Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duran at least being solid rotation guys at minimum.
Yeah,
A star is going to be a big part of the future just because of what he could do defensively, which, I mean, you just can't go out and find defenders like that. Like, that's really tough to do.
right.
But if you're talking about something that could really kind of change the calculus of next season and beyond, it's adding Ron Holland to that group. And like now he's starting to deliver on his like defensive gifts or his playmaking's coming along. He's already a really good finisher at the rim. He's giving you like that downhill pressure. There's just so many different ways he can impact the game that to me, he's the guy that could just kind of flip this thing and like really, really, really get the ball rolling, especially with how young he is. Like he just turned 20. Like that's a guy with a lot of potential and could solve a lot of issues for this team going forward. So I'm gonna go with Ron.
Yeah, I think the thing that excites me about Ron is a lot of the things that he does well are the things that you can't teach, and the areas that he has to
Yeah, that's
grow
exactly it. Yeah,
are the things that you can. Yeah.
yeah,
So, yeah, he
yeah.
has a very, very exciting upside and just a really good head on his shoulders for his age, too. And by the way, the fact that he was literally born after the '05 finals, insanely depressing. I don't know about you, but that was a day I felt my mortality when I learned that.
Yeah, I had already had that moment when they drafted Duran, and I
Yeah.
realized that he was like, not only was he like the first NBA player that I think was like a full 10 years younger than me. I was also covering him, so I had to like kind of face that.
Yeah. He was
So
also the first NBA player drafted after Braun was born.
yeah, also the first NBA player drafted after Braun was born. So I actually didn't realize that about Ron Holland. Like he was born after the two finals appearances. It's like it really puts into perspective like how long ago like those days
Yeah.
were. Um, yeah, that's pretty crazy. Darren had already kind of weakened the shock for me a little bit as far as like me getting older, but
Yeah.
Ron Holland like that's still pretty much a doozy. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
crazy. He wasn't around for the first two. Yeah, that's actually
Yeah,
pretty crazy.
without doubt. I apologize for leaving that fact with you
It's
on that
okay.
note.
It's okay. Like I said, I've already reconciled the fact that I am 30. I'm 31 now actually. Like I'm getting
Yeah.
older, so that's just it is what it is. I'm at the age that NBA players start to, like you're talking about them like they're an old man. So it is what it
Yeah.
is. The only guys in that locker room who are older than me, well, actually now that I think about it, Karis and Bees are both younger than me. Schroeder was older than me a little bit. Yeah, the only guy in that locker room that's older than me is Tobias, I think, at this point.
That's
So
crazy.
hey, yeah,
Yeah, that's wild.
yeah, it is what it is. What can you do?
Yeah. Well, Omari, seriously, dude, thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the pod. I seriously have a lot of respect for you and the work that you do, and especially over the last couple of years, just having the pleasure of seeing it up close and sharing that media room with you. It's I truly mean it's an honor, man, and I always enjoy whenever I have you on the pod. So thank you so much.
Nah, really appreciate that, man. It's been great seeing you do your thing. come up in the media world, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the press conference next season as well. Always happy to be on here.
Yeah, means a lot, man. Thank you. And thank you to those that tuned in as well. Be sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the content coming. Thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you guys next time from Half Court, and be sure you're subscribed.